So Leah, let's start with where your piece takes place in Wisconsin. I guess I guess technically cheese country, but cheese comes from dairy. Yes. So what's the dynamic at play here? Where have we been, and where have we found ourselves in terms of the milk business, the dairy business?
Sure. Well, the dairy business, there used to be many tens of thousands of dairy farmers across the U.S. who all serve different regional markets. And the way that the milk industry is regulated in the U.S. by the Department of Agriculture separates the country out into different regions. And each region, there were thousands of producers who would basically serve their state and the surrounding states. And over time, the dairy cooperatives that once were formed by those farmers to represent them in negotiations with buyers and processors, the companies that would make the cheese, the yogurt, et cetera, those cooperatives became more and more powerful to the point where today we see that the cooperatives themselves have begun to act as sort of monopolistic power hoarders in the system. And the common refrain today from many parts of the country is there are many, many thousands fewer dairy farmers than there once were, and the ones who remain are pretty much obligated to sell to a cooperative, and the cooperative tends to be one of the top two or three cooperatives in the country. And many regions, farmers only have one or maybe two co-ops to choose from, and farmers today allege that those cooperatives are engaging in anti-competitive practices to suppress prices and to otherwise make it harder and harder for the farmers to make a living in the dairy business. So we've really seen the shrinking of the number of farmers and the shrinking of the number of middlemen to the point where it's really a monopsony market, which describes when many suppliers are sort of at the whim of just a few buyers.
Okay, all right. So back up here because that's a lot, obviously, to digest. So back in the day, and when we say back in the day, when are we talking about? Are we talking the 70s, 80s, 90s? I'm old enough to remember where like a milkman would actually show up. But when are we talking about when the last, before the sort of the real change in this system occurred?
Sure. Yeah. I would say that back in the day was as recent as even in the 70s and 80s. We still had a pretty diffuse, pretty diverse national dairy market. And the main character in the story that I wrote is Dairy Farmers of America, which is today the largest dairy cooperative in the country. And Dairy Farmers of America was formed in 1998 as a roll-up of three other large cooperatives. So that's sort of a good line in the sand for when any sort of remaining competition that was happening at the regional level sort of got sucked up into these major national cooperatives that in the past 20 or 30 years have really rolled up control over that space.
So it used to be that these cooperatives were regional. I mean, how many? So how many were there at the height? And just to explain to people, what a cooperative is, it's like you said, it's a way for smaller farmers to negotiate their prices to what, like supermarkets, I presume, primarily?
Yeah, so cooperatives are essentially, well, agricultural producer cooperatives. There can be all different types of cooperatives, but that particular type was envisioned by farmers as a way to sort of work together to increase their power when they were in negotiations with supermarkets, and then later on as agriculture industrialized with processors, similar to a union type of negotiation, power in numbers to level out the playing field a little bit. And so that was the original conceit behind the cooperative. And there were cooperatives for all types of things, for producers, for consumers. I mean, even still today, we have cooperative groceries, things like that. And so it's hard to estimate exactly how many because they were operating at every level of the economy, some statewide or region-wide and some extremely small. But certainly we've seen a dramatic decrease in the number of cooperatives, where today there are, I think, only a few thousand producer cooperatives remaining, and most of those are extremely small.
Now, so we've got these major cooperatives. What was the impetus for them to begin to concentrate? I mean, Do you need do you have cooperatives buying other cooperatives? Is that what's going on here? Was there some type of influx of capital that allowed this consolidation to take place? What drove the consolidation?
Sure. Well, to hear the cooperatives tell the history, they argue that their consolidation throughout the 80s and 90s was in response to consolidation in the processing sector. So around sort of the same time that, in the deregulation period in the 80s, after which we saw a general increase in consolidation and the strength of individual corporations in certain sectors, that trend was happening in the processing sector, where we saw the rise of Dean Foods, which is a huge dairy processor, and others who were putting a lot of pressure on the cooperatives who were basically bullying the cooperatives. And so the cooperatives' response to that was to themselves consolidate. And yes, it was often through buying up other cooperatives and, assuming their membership into their own.
Now, one would think this would provide for more power for the dairy farmers, right? I mean, if your cooperative gets stronger, we should be stronger, right? But that's not how it works.
Right, and I think a lot of dairy farmers believe that. And, part of the cooperative structure is that members often have to approve such deals, and usually they are approved because farmers are told by the leadership of the cooperative, this is just how the economy is. This is what we need to do in order to be able to compete. And a lot of farmers agreed or were compelled by that argument. But what's played out over the past few years in particular is that now that those cooperatives have become so powerful, they've begun to exert pressure on the farmers themselves, which is an inversion of what the cooperative model is supposed to represent. It's supposed to represent the desire of the farmers, not vice versa. But the farmers now find themselves, that they allege, they're sort of being oppressed or controlled by the cooperative board, by the corporate entity that runs the membership organization that they're a part of.
And you mentioned this earlier, but monopsony. Explain that to us, because that's a concept that I think people are familiar with a monopoly. I don't think people are fully clear on what a monopsony is and what the implications are.
Sure. So a monopsony basically describes a market in which there are many sellers competing for just a few buyers, and in that case, the buyers will become price setters, and the sellers have to accept those prices and conditions. So in this particular case, the dairy farmers are the sellers. They have the product, the milk, raw milk that they're selling to the buyers, which are the cooperatives. And cooperatives control about 80% of fluid milk sales from farmers in the U.S. So pretty much the main buyer is the cooperative. And so dairy farmers find themselves in the position of being the price takers from the co-ops and having to accept their terms.
And of course, what that does is it pushes down the price of milk. I mean, we see this with like Walmart, right? That as another example where they'll say, like, you got no one else to sell to because we've been able to eliminate all the competition by going in and dropping prices in all these towns. So now you got to sell to us, but you can't sell it at the price you've been selling it. We're going to put downward pressure on your pricing to us, and people have no choice. And particularly, I would imagine these small dairy farms. All right. Well, when we come back, let's talk about the story of Dairy Farmers of America and what's happening specifically what's happening around that co-op and what the implications are. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to Leah Douglas on how rural America got milked.